Whoa. Hello, nerds. This is an interview from DiNK Denver 2019. This is the Pinis. If you are unfamiliar, they are the writer and authors for the ElfQuest series that has been going for the last 40 plus years now. The reason we are doing this post-introduction, where it's obviously I'm not at the convention anymore, but I'm here on camera, is because we did have a slight technical error with our camera situation. So for a chunk in the middle, I had to get creative with the video editing. So, that being said, this is our... I didn't want to just cut out the footage because I felt like the interview was too important and the audio is fantastic. So, this is our interview with the Pinis.
Quiet on the set, rolling.
Hi, I am Bitsy Telek.
Hey, I'm Hale Appleman.
I'm Walter Kane.
I'm Rene Aubergenois, Odo on Deep Space Nine.
Michael Dorn, Lieutenant Commander Worf, Star Trek The Next Generation.
Come and see me and hear me and talk to me and listen to me talk about myself.
Hey man, this is Kevin Smith, often considered generally nerdy, and you are listening to what is often considered generally nerdy.
On Generally Nerdy.
You're listening to
Generally nerdy.
Generally nerdy.
Generally nerdy.
Once again, nerds, we are here at DiNK Denver, and we actually got the privilege of doing an interview with the Pinis. The Pinis, you might know their previous work, ElfQuest, or their large body of work with ElfQuest, 40 years.
And counting.
And still going. How would you compare when you started 40 years ago to when you put out a book today?
There is no comparison. In 1978, the independent comics field was brand new.
Right.
Retailer shops were brand new. We had an open playing field, and ElfQuest went into that great vacuum and exploded into it. Now, Lord, I mean, just look around.
Very much.
There's so much creativity here, so many people doing their own thing, making their own comics and their own contribution to independent comics. Frankly, if we had to start ElfQuest today, I would be terrified.
Because the field is a very different place. And now what you started was a cup of water in a desert because it didn't exist very much. I mean, that's not to say you were the first, but you were definitely one of the first large profile in indies.
Well,
now everyone's an indie, so yeah, I can totally see that. And I'm sorry.
Well, there are some ways in which ElfQuest was a first because it was the first fantasy comic to be written and drawn by a woman. It is considered to be America's first manga and anime influenced
I did not know
comic.
that.
You could say that ElfQuest is the first American manga.
That's interesting.
Yes,
Nice.
yes.
Nice.
It also was the very first graphic novel series done in America to make it into the big chain bookstores.
I did know that one. That one I did know. So, because it would be considered the first American manga, have you guys gone to Japan and do you have like a strong following out there for traditional manga readers?
We were invited to Japan in 1994 because the Japanese publisher industry wanted representatives from American comics. They brought out Will Eisner, sort of the grand statesman.
Right.
They brought out some artists and writers from DC Comics representing the mainstream, and they brought us out representing independent comics.
They also wanted a woman, because so many women work in the manga industry in Japan. Yeah. It's normal there. Yeah. But back in the mid-90s, it was still kind of rare. So they wanted a female voice added to the group.
And I think they wanted to pick our brains a little bit. Mm-hmm. People have asked, well, have you been translated into Japanese since you are manga influenced? And we found out a very interesting thing. The Japanese don't want to translate an American manga comic into Japanese. but they were willing to have Wendy create a new comic for them. Specifically for them to publish and then license back to the U.S.
In other words, to compete with ourselves on the shelves.
So we don't know to this day how large the fan base is in Japan. We do know that at anime conventions, a lot of people know of ElfQuest and are fans of it. All we do know is that ElfQuest is known around the world and has been translated into a dozen or so languages.
That's really awesome. Sorry, I'm kind of taken aback by the whole thing. So is this your first underground comics convention? Probably not.
No,
so this is your first DiNK specifically.
Yeah.
So have you guys done Cake in the past? The Chicago Expo or I can't remember. Comic Book Anime Chicago something. It's in Chicago.
C2E2?
No. C2E2 is a different one. Cake is like DiNK just in Chicago.
No,
you've never done
not.
Cake. So what is probably a more well-known underground convention you've done besides DiNK?
Oh, that is a tough one to answer.
I think, to be honest with you, we have not done something that is this aggressively indie in many, many years.
Yeah.
I can recall years ago going to Ape.
Okay.
And there's another one whose name or acronym I can't remember.
All these acronyms.
SPX, the Small Press Expo.
Okay.
But we haven't been to one of those in a long, long time. This is revisiting something we haven't seen in a long time.
Well, you see, ElfQuest started out as a fully independent comic, but it also has the distinction of having been published by the top 3 mainstream publishers. Currently we're with Dark Horse, but Marvel and DC has also published and reprinted new material from ElfQuest. So we occupy a very strange spot because, are we truly an independent comic? Well, yes, we own the rights and have never let them go.
And you didn't let Marvel and DC or Dark Horse tell you this needs to be in your book.
No, nobody messed with it. On the other hand, we have certainly collaborated with and had a fine relationship with these great big mainstream companies.
What I have said, it's almost a catchphrase right now, independence does not equal isolation. And sometimes people in the independent community have looked at us as almost as traitors because we're getting into bed with the enemy if we're licensed.
Right. Yeah, I'm sure you've heard that a lot.
Yes.
But my
jealous.
There you go. Jealous much? My feeling has always been number one reason is to get the story out there.
Yeah.
And if someone who is bigger than we are, who has resources that we don't have, is willing to partner with us in a non-intrusive, non-destructive relationship, we will use the hell out of them just as they're using the hell out of us.
Absolutely, why not?
Yeah.
It's mutually beneficial. That makes total sense.
And it's advice we would give anybody in the independent comics today. If you can find a partner that is more established, that wants to work with you, but retain your rights, why not?
So there was actually some really interesting comic book news that just happened. I believe it was Avanti Press. I might be misremembering the name of the company, but they're opening it up so they will. It's comic books made to order. So you make a comic book. Say you were to start today, like you said, you would be so afraid to do. Say you started your own comic book today and you've never done it before. You have no connections in the industry. You send them your mains. They will turn it into a book for you, and you have to buy your books. It's like 80 cents a book. Okay. So that right there lowers the bar for entry for anyone to get it, because you can. It's on newsprint, so it's not like the high quality semi-gloss stuff that you're seeing in stores, but that's how a lot of these indie comics work. So, does that give you hope, even more hope, I guess I should say, for the indie community?
There is an old saying in the independent comics industry, which is anybody can get their first issue out. The trick is, can you get your second issue out and your third, and so on?
Can you maintain?
Can you maintain on time, on schedule? That's the trick, is endurance. Yes. Because when a lot of these kids find out how hard it is, how expensive it is, how it will consume every minute of your life if you let it. Now, many are called, but few are chosen.
Also, and this is purely pragmatic, when we started, it was a very simple system. You somehow got your comic book produced,
Right.
which written, drawn, printed.
And that's, I think, the big step that most people don't know where to start. That's why the Avanti thing is such big news. But I apologize. Continue.
And that's fine. And that is where they can go with it. But for us, 40 years ago, a big, huge part of it was distribution.
Yeah.
How are all of these kids, how were we going to get our comics seen by enough people to buy enough copies so that we didn't go broke?
Right.
And back then there was a distribution system that consisted of a dozen independent distributors. Now there's exactly one, and that's Diamond.
Yeah.
And they have their criteria for getting in, into the catalog. But if you're not with Diamond, how do you get seen? That's not a question that I am prepared to answer. I don't pretend to know all the avenues via the web, via print catalogs, and all of that.
My theory is the internet plays a huge part in a lot of kids getting their properties seen and talked about and responded to, and feedback. The internet, I would say, is a vital component of you as an independent publisher now.
Absolutely. And that actually goes for all or not just comic creators, but content creators in general. That is absolutely the 100% truth. That is the only way to get seen anymore. And even then, it's a drop in the ocean.
It is a very crowded field. Yeah. And just as we had to do 40 years ago by having a product that people loved that grew in circulation with every issue, you have to rise above all of the voices on the internet if you want to become well known, if you want to become a success. I don't know how people define success anymore.
Actually, last year at this very convention, one of the panels kind of was about that, because it was independent creators who had written on both sides. They'd been indie, but they had also written for the big two. And a successful book for the big two was like a few tens of thousands, and a successful book for an indie print is like maybe 2,000. So it really depends on what you're trying to do. But that's a fantastic point to make, is how do you define success?
What we wanted to do back then was not go broke.
Just wanted to survive on your art.
I had a day job. For the first 6-7 issues of ElfQuest, I was working at IBM. I was bringing in a biweekly paycheck that was paying the bills and paying the rent and all of that stuff. So we didn't have the concern that I suspect a lot of independent creators may have. It was only after ElfQuest established itself, maybe we can make a living at it, that I quit IBM, and we have been, quote, independent in that sense ever since.
That's very, very impressive. So switching gears slightly, going to the content of ElfQuest, because our social climate is in a very different place than when you guys started.
No kidding.
But I mean, that is to say the diversity issue and all that. But also, there have been some racier elements of ElfQuest. I mean, Charlie made the point last night during the Dinkies that he used to get your books at porn shops.
Well, he came by the table earlier today to clarify that. It was a used magazine shop that
also
had porn.
Had lots
he was
of
very, very particular about that. And I told him, no, you found it at a porn shop. That's what we're saying from here on.
In anticipation of your question, possibly, but maybe not, what I want to jump in and say is we are really, really shocked that the issues that were the issues of the day back in the mid-'70s, racism, homophobia, politics, hate, war, gun issues, gun violence. We are shocked and stunned that here we are, 40 years later. And what are the main issues of the day?
Homophobia, gun violence.
A little bit of a different angle, but it's legit. I'll give it to you.
So when we started ElfQuest, we wrote about things we cared about. We wanted to see if we could come up with solutions to some of these problems, and we found that the solution most often existed in the triumph of knowledge over ignorance, not the triumph of good versus evil, but the triumph of knowledge over ignorance. And so we kept that theme going all the way to present day. And now that message seems to be more important than ever.
And that is a fantastic point to make. But the where I was going to go with that is the pushback that you receive for not only just addressing those things, but having slightly more mature theme. Yeah. So did you get much pushback when you started, and are you still, or do you now get different pushback?
It's ironic. Everybody talks about the infamous orgy issue as the example of, if you're going to get pushback, that was the issue you're going to get pushback on.
Yeah.
And I'll tell you the pushback we got. With regard to the sexuality, which was understated and elegant, we got across the spectrum. We got a letter from an 11-year-old boy who said, "Thank you for not talking down to me." We also got a letter from, a middle-aged mother who tore those pages out of the issue, shredded them, and sent them back to us. Now, what we found so ironic about that was that also in this issue, there's violence. There are elves and trolls getting sliced and diced. And apparently she didn't have a problem with her kid reading that.
Yeah.
And that was the perfect illustration of the insane hypocrisy of this culture that we live in, that war and violence, bloodshed is fine, but sex is still taboo, it's still naughty, it's still don't do that. That was what we got then. These days, I think, thanks to social media, we get a lot more positive feedback.
Oh, definitely.
From readers who say, "Thank you, I found myself in ElfQuest. Your story of this character helped me overcome a similar problem that I was going through." We get a lot more of that. I can't recall really nasty pushback we've gotten recently.
No. After all these years of following the story, I mean, we've made huge demands on our fans. We've asked them to follow the story for 40 years, and many of them have. Can you imagine? And so
there's a lot of big 2 books that don't have that kind of following.
Yeah.
Well, and so they've been with us, heart and soul. And as we brought them to the conclusion of a big hero's journey, a big story arc, the inevitability, the way we set it up, and the inevitability of the story, they accepted it. Even if it meant some losses, they accepted it because we had built towards it as an inevitability.
That's awesome.
We had concerns that those final issues, oh my God, they're going to hate us, they're going to hate the book, they're this, that, and the other thing. And 99.99% of the feedback was, this really tore me up, or I really had a strong reaction to this, but it was perfect. It was the way it was supposed to end.
Nice. So that's actually a pretty elegant transition into how I wanted to end this interview, is because you do have 40 years of following. You do have these diehard fans who have read since book 1. That, like I just said, that is not something that the big 2 have really at all. I mean, there's people who are familiar with the story, but they'll drop books for a while because the writer will change, or they just lose interest because it starts to drag.
Constantly rebooting the story.
And that's the big one. So, what would be your advice, because you guys are seasoned veterans at this point, what would be your advice to the big 2 so that they... Because sales are in the toilet these days for the mainline comic books. So what would be your advice to the big 2 to fix that, if that's possible?
If it ain't broke, don't fix it. Quit messing with these wonderful characters. Quit taking them in directions they wouldn't naturally go.
But see, that's the problem.
Amen.
That's the problem. They don't know their own characters well enough to know a long-term direction, because mainstream comics are done the way they are done, and this is a fact of life.
Yeah.
Marvel, DC, they need to reboot Spider-Man, Superman, Batman
They expect
every
the
3
readership
years.
to turn
Every
over.
3 years, because
Yeah.
the readership, once they get past a certain age, they lose interest in comics. They got to grab them back again.
Lose interest in comics. You guys are living proof that that is not the case.
Look, we set out to tell a story that was important to us. It
Right.
didn't matter how many issues it took. It didn't matter how many years it might take. We had it mapped out from the start. And there were times when it was bloody hard to keep on going. But we knew we had to finish it or else we would not be able to sleep at night.
Yeah.
And we just did it our way. And those readers who were willing to take that ride with us, they took that ride, some of them for 40 years. Some of them are reading it to their kids. Some of those kids are reading it to grandkids.
Right.
It is generational. It speaks to people on a heart-deep level.
He's ElfQuest's biggest fan.
And that's not a business model, I believe, that a big corporate comic book publisher either knows about or is willing to hew to. There's no answer to your question, how do they fix it?
Fair enough.
I'm sorry, guys,
No answer that would continue them making as much money as they want to make.
But a word of hope. The characters are essentially sound. They are archetypes. You go back to the archetype of Superman. You go back to the archetype of Batman, Captain America, all of them.
Yes.
You find who they are there. Go back to the beginning.
That is fantastic advice. And thank you, Peenies, once again for sitting down with Generally Nerdy and Big Show Entertainment Network. You guys are an influence to generations of artists, not just generations of readers. So it is awesome that you guys showed up at DiNK. And nerds, this is going to be probably one of the bigger interviews, so I appreciate you guys sticking around, and hopefully some of this advice will make it through not only to the new creators, but the creators we all follow as well. So thank you, Peenies.
As we said last night at the Dinky Awards, where we were tremendously honored, if we could do it, you can do it. Just be true.
Absolutely. So again, thank you guys for watching. This might be our last interview for the day. That was so perfect. If somebody has not gotten into ElfQuest yet, how can they find you?
Here, this is easy. You go to ElfQuest.com. That's our website. On the home page, up in the upper right corner, there's a little button that says Read Online. You click that and you are taken to an index of the first 35 years, something like 6,500 pages of ElfQuest from issue 1, page 1, on up to Final Quest, and you can read it online for free. That was our gift to new readers. That was our gift to old readers who have wanted to catch up. It's risk-free. It's fun. Enjoy it. Jump in the water.
Awesome. And we'll see you nerds later.